So thank you everybody for joining. Today we're going to be talking about a number of things, but just to get us going, start with some quick introductions. So my name is Bruce Cullen. I am the Director of Products here at Cookdown. I'm guessing you guys have heard me on various videos and whatnot before, so I won't spend too much time on me, but I have a special guest here with me in the studio. Would like to introduce yourself, special guest?
Hello, thanks for having me, Bruce. Yeah, I'm Paul Godwin. I'm a Customer Solutions Engineer here at SquaredUp. Been working with SquaredUp very recently for the last few months, and yeah, it's been good.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. So without further ado, I guess we'll crack on with today's webinar. We're actually here today to talk about reading minds, which might sound a bit kind of counterintuitive, but very specifically, we're talking about reading your CIO's mind. If you're in an organization that has ServiceNow and SCOM, there's a reasonable chance that I can tell what they're thinking about. And that is going to be service mapping. The vast majority of companies that have ServiceNow and SCOM have already started to think about things like integrating SCOM alerts through into ServiceNow as incidents. And now they're looking at, well, what next? They're looking at things like CMDB population and ultimately service mapping, which is kind of the end goal. So service mapping is a hot topic right now, but let's just frame that a bit in terms of what we're talking about. So what is a service map? So what we're looking at here is, unsurprisingly, a service map. So there's a few things in here. From the very top of this, we've got a business service. This is a real customer example, by the way. Now, a business service is typically a kind of abstract from the technology itself. So in this case, this is the transport management business service. In a typical company, it's likely that this will be owned by a team or a manager, something to that effect, and they might own multiple service offerings underneath their business service. And in the case of my example, the service offering here is the TDP offering. So this can be made up of one or more installations of the TDP application, which is what we have at that third level down. So typically this would look like a kind of pyramid where the further down you go, the more objects there are. These are all called configuration items in ServiceNow's CMDB. So then you have the application service itself. You might have multiples of these. You might have, for example, one for dev and one for production. And then underneath those, we have the actual CIs themselves. So we've got Windows servers, we've got services, we've got disks and network adapters, that kind of thing. So with any, typically this is what that structure would look like. Before we kind of move on to talking about creating these, one thing that's really important to note is why these matter in an organization. So the reason why these matter is for understanding the impact of incidents. So let's say in this the case of this Windows server, one of the physical disks goes pop on that server. What's the impact of that disk going pop to the guy that owns transport management? And depending on what exactly has happened, it could be a big deal or it could be no impact at all. So let's say it's both of those disks that have gone pop. Then that incident really does matter because the Windows server, which the application service depends on, is down. There's only one application service in the service offering, so that will be down as well. So ultimately, that incident pegged against the disks will affect the business service of transport management. So in a nutshell, it's all about flowing up incidents and the severity of those incidents from the lowest level to the highest level, depending on their impact. So there's another important thing to say about this. At the top of this service, we have the manually defined portion. So this is the business service and the service offering. So these sorts of things are typically stored in org structures. They're stored in PowerPoints. They're not sort of programmatically discoverable, and they will vary wildly company on company. And then at the bottom, we have the programmatically discoverable bits and pieces. So in this case, this is an application installation sitting on top of a copy of Windows with some disks and bits and pieces. And this is what we're going to spend today focusing on. And this is where Cookdown service mapping comes in, which is all about joining the dots in between those individual pieces of configuration and the overall service that they provide. So Cookdown service mapping is not a straightforward traditional product. It's actually a solution made up of products from multiple companies, which is why I have my glamorous guest Paul here with me to help me explain the concepts of what's going on here. But before we dig into kind of demos, let's just take a quick look at the abstract now, so we can see all of the moving parts. So we have SquaredUp as one of the moving parts. For those of you who aren't aware, SquaredUp is a dashboarding product. They have a version that sits on top of SCOM and a version that sits on top of Azure. It does dashboarding for SCOM to make sense of all of the complicated SCOM data that exists. And they also do application mapping for SCOM. So obviously there is a dependency on SCOM. I would think that everybody on this call will have at least some kind of understanding of what SCOM is, but it's, you know, the best of breed enterprise IT monitoring platform, monitors your enterprise IT estate and lets you know when things go down. On the other side of the world, in your IT department, you have ServiceNow. ServiceNow is all about many things these days, but traditionally incident management. It has a database called the CMDB made up of configuration items that are joined up to make service maps. And traditionally, there was a nasty old line down the middle. So these were two sort of separate worlds that wouldn't really interact much, if at all. That has all changed, though, with the introduction of the Cookdown Discovery product, which pushes up SCOM objects into ServiceNow along with their relationships. So in other words, allows us to use all of the power of these tools together to do service mapping in ServiceNow along with CMDB population. At a high level, this is how it works. So you start off by building out your application map using SquaredUp's Veda technology, and Paul will tell us a bit about that in a moment. These are then saved into SCOM as what are called enterprise applications. So Paul, what's the sort of 2-second version of what an enterprise application is?
Oh, well, don't know whether I've got a 2-second version, but yeah, certainly. Well, yes, Veda is the application mapping piece, the actual mapping feature of that piece. But an enterprise application is our way of sort of doing an improved version of a distributed application. So you've got a 3-part application model of which you can use different sort of elements of those 3 parts, or altogether it's quite powerful because you've got the availability monitoring set up separately from the infrastructure mapping, and that availability monitoring will handle the health state, and you get more accurate health status and SLA reports on your applications, yet still have that infrastructure mapping component to keep an eye on the health of the infrastructure underneath.
Sounds good. So DA's on steroids with lots more awesome availability stuff in there. Yeah. We'll see all of those in a moment. That's good for setting the scene. And then finally, we have pushing of those saved applications into ServiceNow. So the key piece here is we use ServiceNow's identification and reconciliation API. Not the most catchy title in the world, but it's very important because the API and the engine that sort of sits underneath that API handles the creation or not creation of duplicate CIs and prevents you from creating duplicates. That's a very important piece of the problem. But before we get into the how to do this, let's just take a step back for a second and think about why. Why do we want to do this with SCOM? Because there are many other ways of doing service mapping in ServiceNow. The most common approach is using ServiceNow's own tooling. ServiceNow have their own discovery and mapping products that are a combination of kind of network scanners and agents. They have an agent type thing called the mid server, and it's one of those sits in each network segment. And they work quite well for things like port scanning to figure out what's on your network. And where it can access things, they do a very good job. So why would you even consider something like using SCOM to do this? The answer is really simple. Security is the answer. SCOM has agents everywhere. If you have SCOM, you've already gone through the pain of setting it up and have all the permissions you need to access all of those resources that you need for service mapping. SCOM holds data on everything that it monitors, which is really important. There's no new discovery because SCOM has all of this data. And therefore, SCOM doesn't need any extra passwords. All you need to do is join the dots between your existing tooling and use your existing data, which does already exist, rather than discover this data afresh, which means There are no ports to open because you're not discovering this data. You haven't got to traverse firewalls and whatnot by what your SCOM agents are already doing. So yeah, no issues in traversing firewalls. No extra passwords are required. SCOM has access to everything. My favorite example of having access to everything is with kind of traditional service mapping and discovery products. In the case of SQL database, they effectively need SQL database administration privileges to discover the databases on each database server. Now, for some companies, that will be no problem at all. But for a large enterprise, that will be a very bitter pill to swallow. And SCOM, obviously, it's monitoring those databases. It doesn't have DBA permissions. So it has all of the data that we need. So why don't we just use that existing data? Very key point. So this is the sort of process now. This screenshot is of Veda, which is the SquaredUp tooling for mapping out applications. So this is what they would look like when you're discovering them through the SquaredUp UI using those SCOM agents. And then this is the result in ServiceNow. So in this screenshot, we have a business service with a bunch of bits and pieces, disks and databases and servers and all the rest of it that hang off it. And that is what we are going to demo today. So let me just now jump into demo land. And this is where I'm going to need your help, Paul. So tell me where to go and what to click to map out an enterprise application.
Yes. So yes, when you log into SquaredUp, this will be by default the first screen you see. So you'll actually have a link on here to map a new enterprise application. But if you just go to applications, the top menu there, you'll see enterprise applications. So if we click on that, you get this nice window here. So what you have is a little orange plus icon there. We actually click on that. And this will probably give a more visual representation of what I meant by that three-part application model. So,
oh, yeah, I see.
Yeah. So if you're looking at this sort of enterprise application sort of side of things, you've got that availability monitoring piece. We'll give you some different ways of doing that. But you can look up sort of the enterprise application pieces on other webinar videos that we have off our SquaredUp YouTube channel. But once you've got your availability monitoring place, whether you want, you can do sort of URL, TCP monitors, PowerShell scripts, or even use existing monitoring within SCOM. But the piece we're more interested in today is the mapping piece. So if we actually click on map components or even map in the top perspective there, we get this lovely template here, which this is actually Veda, which is a visual application discovery and analysis tool, which we will from now on just continue to call Veda for the interest of time. But yeah, so you get this sort of three-part model template, but you don't have to have this sort of web app DB sort of style design here. You can sort of create your own groups here. But all you have to do really, and this is the beauty of Veda, is that you might not necessarily understand every single server or component of your application. But if you do know at least one part, you've got somewhere to start. So if you click on the plus icon in one of these boxes here, you can then search on maybe a server or component that's within your SCOM environment.
All right. So I don't know enough about the architecture of SquaredUp, so I'm actually going to use this to map out SquaredUp itself. So I mean, obviously I can see I'm connected to the SquaredUp server on Infra Web 01. I don't know what the architecture is. So I'm going to type in Infra Web 01 and see what it looks like.
There you go. So yep, searches on all those objects within SCOM, and you found that Infra Web 01 is part of that. Right. So yep. So this is, as you alluded to before, is just using your SCOM agents. So there's no new SquaredUp agents, and it's doing an on-demand discovery. So it's not storing any data in any databases. It's just purely utilizing those SCOM agents. So it's run a discovery to notice what components and services and processes are running on there, and you'll see them listed here. And then you can sort of look for maybe in this case, you can see sort of an application pool and websites. So I can see an Ops 18 in there. So I'm sure that's probably going to be relevant to your application in this case.
You are right. So /ops 18 is the website I'm on. So I'm going to add in that specific one.
You can just add that in.
But just when I do that, just to rewind. So what you're saying is when I added this in, SquaredUp and SCOM are prodding the SCOM agent itself on this box and saying what's on you.
Yep, it's running some data on demand sort of SCOM tasks, so it actually runs discoveries on that agent directly on the server where that agent's installed for those servers and components. When you actually click add on that, it's actually running that netstat task to get a sort of a snapshot of that network traffic that it's communicating with, and starts to build those relationships between those services and processes.
Sounds good. Okay. So I've added in my website. I don't need the rest of that list now.
Nope.
And then I have another box. I guess I'll click this.
You can just click again and run the same process again.
And while it's doing it, I notice a number here. What's this number all about?
Yep. So as part of that, so obviously it's done that sort of snapshot of that traffic. It's noticed that it's communicating that particular web application that you've actually added into the map. It's detected that it's communicating with a Microsoft service on that Ops 18 SCOM01 box there on port 5724.
That's quite useful, as you say, for kind of troubleshooting, you know, figuring out how my application kind of hangs together. And cool. I can see only one. Was that a Windows service? It looks like to
looks
me.
like that to me. Yep.
Okay. Cool. Is there anything else on this box? Is this just one service here?
Well, if you actually click the arrow underneath the service there, you can actually see some of the other services that would have discovered. Some of these are grayed out because you can add global filters on those processes using the filters option in the top right hand corner to sort of, you know, those sort of bits that you know that aren't going to be of interest within your applications. You can sort of filter those out. But yeah, I mean, even if it will automatically add in any that sort of like has a relationship with the components you've added on that previous server. But you can, of course, add them in manually here if you needed to add anything else, or indeed if it hadn't discovered that during the on-demand.
Makes sense. Okay, perfect. Oh, cool. Well, I mean, it knows this service is being talked to and these aren't, so I'm going to trust it for now and collapse that menu and continue to kind of walk the tree. So we're going to prod this box and see what we get here. From the name, I could take a guess as to what's on the server, but let's see.
Yeah, and the great thing is with that component discovery and that sort of mapping those relationships, you'll see it's actually discovered the database server and the databases it's actually related to.
And the data is okay. So that's a key point here. So if I expand this list, so there's more databases, quite a few more databases on this SQL instance than are being talked to. So we know these ones are being talked to and these aren't, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. But you could add them in if you want to, but obviously they're not a part of that application. So it's added in the databases that services are related to. But if it didn't detect that discovery and it was part of the application, you could add it in manually there.
Okay, makes sense. And just following the lines between these objects, I see the SQL service is talking to another box called SQL01.
Yes.
So I'm guessing this is a SQL cluster.
So you can see that line that it had there is sort of like a bi-directional communication between those two servers. So you can guess that is a SQL cluster of some description.
Cool. And I guess the real proof will be if these databases are available on the second server, that proves it's some kind of database cluster, but that the where are we? 18 DB. There it is, an 18 DW.
Yep. So as you see, you can manually add in those components if you wish to.
Sounds good. So I guess these databases are not currently being actively talked to, and these ones are, which is why they weren't filtered in,
or at least at the time of discovery.
At the time of discovery, as you say. But the fact they're there says this is an active passive cluster kind of deal. You get the idea. I'm just going to retitle this group because this is clearly SCOM itself from looking at the service names. And you get the idea. So we've basically walked the tree between all of the agents on these boxes and joined the dots. So I guess normally you'd give these things a name and save them.
Yep. So all those component groups and the application itself have to have a name.
Cool. Webinar demo, and then you'd hit save. Helps if I can type.
Indeed, yes. If you've got the permissions to do so, it will actually give you the option to save that into SCOM. Saves that enterprise application into SCOM. If you didn't have that set permission, you can use the box in the top right hand corner, which is that's the one there. So you can actually export that XML management pack and actually import that. Hand that to someone who has got permissions to import that.
So I guess that's quite useful for the case where you want the team that owns this application to map it out because they know the shape of it, but you don't want to give them SCOM permissions to muck around with management packs.
Exactly that. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm not going to save this because it would take about 5 minutes for the MP to be saved into SCOM and to for the configuration changes to propagate around SCOM. It's a distributed system after all. So in kind of true demo style, here's one I made earlier. I've actually mapped out SquaredUp here, Ops 18 SquaredUp. And if I click on the map, you'll see what this will look like in its completed form. So yes, it's a 3-tier app. We have a web tier with one server in it. We have 2 SCOM servers and a database at the back. And that's what this would look like in SCOM. And that's great from a monitoring perspective. But I thought this was about ServiceNow. I hear you cry. So that's where the SCOM console comes in. Let me just fire this up while I talk. And while I introduce another component. So this will be Cookdown Discovery, which is the thing that pushes up SCOM objects into ServiceNow as configuration items along with their relationships. So if I go to the administration pane and scroll down to the bottom, you will see the ServiceNow connector. And there are two pieces to it. There's Alerts, which is the Alert Sync product, which I'll touch on really briefly at the end, and Discovery. Discovery is all about pushing up those CIs into ServiceNow. And if I click on something over here, you will get a sort of better feel for how these work. So what you're looking at here is what is called a payload. These payloads they're in JSON format, and they contain all of the information for the CIs that we want to create in ServiceNow from SCOM. So here, for example, you can see I'm going to be creating websites in this table, the CMDB CI website table. You can see the properties of the CI I'm going to create. So I'm going to put something in TCP ports, something in description, something in name, etc. If this was just for a specific single website, rather than this long string of data here, you would see a port number. So for example, 80. This is actually a key, what is called a key. It's how we, in Cookdown Discovery land, reference a SCOM object's property. So when we run this payload through the Cookdown Discovery engine, this key gets replaced with a specific value for each object in this class. I'm not going to go into all of the details for how this works here. There's another webinar that exists from a couple of months ago that goes into all the details as to how Discovery works. I was going to touch on the pieces that are unique and are kind of important for service mapping. This will just give you a feel. So the other thing you'll see in this payload is other CI classes from ServiceNow. And this is because in ServiceNow, a website as a CI can't exist in isolation. It has to be related to a web server. And if I scroll down, you'll see a Windows server in there too. So that web server can't live in isolation either. So these are all defined in the payload, along with, if I keep going down, the relationships between them. And that's great. All of this relates to websites, web servers, and Windows servers. But I've seen no mention in here of an enterprise application or anything to do with applications. And that's because there are actually two payloads in here. One for when an object belongs to an enterprise application, and one for when an object does not. So this is for the websites that don't belong to an enterprise application. If I click this button here, you'll see the payload used when an object is inside of an enterprise application. And you'll see when I toggle between these buttons, not a lot seems to change. If I scroll down, the only thing that's different in here is this piece here. So this relates to the table in ServiceNow where I'm going to create my service. So this is the table for the application service. And I provided information about my enterprise application in the form of these keys. So in the case of my demo example, just looking at SCOM, Ops 18 SquaredUp, this is my, oops, oh, I've minimized all of SCOM. That's never good. There we go. Where was I? I was in the SCOM console. So yes, the Ops 18 SquaredUp enterprise application, the name of it is that. So that key will get replaced with that if I push this up to ServiceNow. The other thing you can see in here is an extra relationship that specifies how the website relates to our enterprise application in ServiceNow speak. So it's a depends on use by relationship. And what we're saying here is that the application service depends on the website, and all the rest of it is the same with the same types of relationships. Again, there's a whole webinar that goes into the how you create these and why these types of relationships are defined. The main thing just to emphasize here is that for the vast majority of cases, you don't actually have to build these yourself. On the Cookdown Discovery payload library, we have built these configurations for you for the vast majority of use cases. And as long as you haven't customized your CMDB in any sort of depth, these payloads will work just fine. And even if you have customized your CMDB, these will be a useful kind of starting point for your discovery and service mapping. They go hand in hand. So once you have built out your enterprise application in SquaredUp like this, and you've built out your payloads for all of the technologies that are on here, so the website, the Windows servers, the Windows services, etc., in Cookdown Discovery, you would either hit run now, or these have a schedule in them so they can run periodically and push their CIs up to ServiceNow. The result in ServiceNow looks a bit like this. So if I go to the application services table, I've already run this in the background. I have my Ops 18 SquaredUp application service. And if I click into this thing, you'll see all the bits and pieces that make it up. I'm going to show it in pretty picture form in ServiceNow's dependency view and put it in radial mode so I can get my head around it. So in the middle, we have our application service, which relates to the SquaredUp enterprise application. We're looking at websites. So we've got our website here with our depends on used by relationship. The website runs on the web server. So we can see our hosts on hosts relationship here. And that runs on top of a Windows server. So there you go. Those are all of the relationships. For some of these bits and pieces like database, if I expand the relationships here, you'll see the same kind of idea. We've got databases running on SQL instances. I'll go a bit deeper here. You can basically traverse the relationships between all of these bits and pieces. So now we've gone a level deeper. We're starting to see things that aren't relating to this enterprise application, but are in your CMDB. So we've got, for example, the network adapters now for these Windows servers. So an important point about this is nowhere in VADA did we specify that we didn't specify anything to do with the network adapters of this Windows server. As long as they exist in ServiceNow, so that could be by being pushed up from Cookdown Discovery, or it could be from another discovery source in ServiceNow, let's say the ServiceNow SCCM connector, for example, that all of that data is available in the context of the enterprise application. So we can layer effectively that data and get a kind of nice layering effect going here. So there we go. That's the results in ServiceNow. Versus traditional tools, it's a lot more straightforward to get the same results because of permissions, ports, and access to things, because SCOM has done all of the heavy lifting for you. And there we go. So just to kind of take a step back for a second, we've been talking about service mapping. Service mapping is one product that makes up our ServiceNow connector suite of products. So we have Alert Sync in here. This is all about pushing SCOM alerts up into ServiceNow as incidents to automate that process. There's a version that works with ServiceNow's event management module and a version that works independently. There is our discovery product, which we've touched on quite a bit today, which is all about pushing SCOM objects up into ServiceNow to populate the CMDB. And then the subject of today's webinar has been service mapping. So joining the dots between those individual CIs to build out services using SquaredUp, SCOM, and the Veda technology. More information on these and everything we've talked about is at cookdown.com/ServiceNow-connector. So that is perfect. We've got 1 minute to go, which is excellent. So just to quickly mention our next webinar. So we're back on the 27th of March at the same time. And next time we're focusing on SCOM specifically. And our next webinar is on getting alert tuning tips from the masters. If you go to cookdown.com/webinar, after this webinar, I'll be updating that link to point to this next new webinar. What's going to be really cool about this next one is I've got some more awesome guest speakers joining me. Not to say you're not awesome, Paul. I know you're awesome too.
I'm not offended. It sounds like it should be a good one to see, though.
It will be a good one. It will be. We have Gavin Speed from Apogove. Apogove are a SCOM and SCCM consultancy, and Gavin's been around SCOM for a very long time. We're joined by Stoyan Chachalov who is also a SCOM consultant and multi-time MVP in data center and cloud. We have Christian Heitkamp from NICE, who will be talking to us about the Oracle Management Pack and tuning that. And we have Sean Williams from SquaredUp, who is a SquaredUp technical evangelist, used to work for Purdue University. And between these 4 guests and myself, we're going to be looking at getting some tips for how to tune a few bits of technology, ranging from SCOM itself through to SQL with SQL databases and SQL instances. We've got Oracle databases in the mix and Active Directory as well. So if that sounds interesting, it should be a really good webinar on the 27th of March at 3 p.m. And that is perfect. We've made it to time. So thank you very much for joining. If you want any more information, feel free to ask questions in the chat window. Of course, you can email us hello@cookdown.com, and we're on Twitter @team_cookdown. So before we go, thank you very much for joining me, Paul, and for giving me an insight into the wonderful magic of Veda.
No problem. Thanks for having me.